Yes, this was a list of questions. The overall theme was, well, if we were created, why are there all these problems? I'll just deal with three issues. Some of the questions do actually overlap because they are questions that seem to have embedded themselves in the general um, evolutionary beliefs, and even though they have been answered, they do persist. So we'll continue with those. So one group of questions was to do with the eye, about why there are certain failings in the eye, and in particular about the light sensitive layer at the back of the eye. So this is looking down on the eye. Light is coming there from the top. It goes through the lens, it gets refracted, and eventually gets to the light sensitive layer uh, at the back there, which in this diagram is colored yellow there. Now, if we were to have a look at that layer under a microscope, it's absolutely jam-packed full of millions of cells, all tightly packed in. And the interesting thing about it is that the cells that are responsible for changing the light signal into electrical signals that go to the brain to be processed is not at the front. So in this diagram, you'll see up the top there, light and a small arrow. That is the direction the light is coming from. But the light sensitive cells, which are called rods and cones, you've probably heard of those, are not directly in line there. They're at the back. And this has intrigued scientists for quite a while. And the evolutionists have said, oh, well, this is just an example of an evolutionary accident. Something went wrong after all. It is chance random processes. So this is what happens. But that's not a scientific approach. A scientific approach is, well, here's something that looks odd, but it works. After all, we can see. So the scientific approach is to do some more research and find out. And some scientists, not necessarily creationists, have done just that. They have approached this with a proper scientific understanding. All right, here is something that looks odd. We need to investigate it and see how it works. Now, I don't know whether the people who have studied the retina and found out how it works are creationists. I suspect not, although some of them are Jews, they may be. But they have done the right thing in terms of having a mindset. Here is something that works. It looks like it's designed, but we don't understand how it works. Now, we've got millions and millions of cells all jam-packed into there. If we were to have a look at all those different sorts of cells, the back of the eye there is extremely complicated with a lot of circuitry there. It's almost like a little part of the brain. So if we were to unpack that and look at the cells that you find in the light sensitive layer, which is called the retina, it turns out that there are some interesting cells which were previously written off as just being there to sort of generally support and hold the retina together. Now, they're the blue cells that are labeled Mg. Now, they're called Muller cells. There are a lot of things in the body which are named after the person who originally discovered them. The reason they're labeled as Mg is that stands for Muller glia. Now, glia is a general term. It just means glue, and there are lots of cells in the brain which just help hold it together. But we're discovering they actually have a lot more function than that. So the cells there labeled Mg, the blue ones, are important here because they are the ones that actually initially collect the light, and they act like fiber optic cables that light is conveyed through those. The light doesn't have to bounce around through all those millions of other cells and eventually land in a cone or a rod cell. The Muller cells conduct the light through all those layers, and during that time they actually correct certain aberrations that you get from light being conveyed, because white light is a mixture of wavelengths, and in order to get the clearest definition for any image so that we can see all the different colors particularly, the wavelengths have to be sort of kept in line. And the Mueller cells do that. And one of the groups of people who did the original research on these wrote this statement in their paper, right, the retina is revealed as an optimal structure designed for improving the sharpness of image. So here is a classic example of evolution is actually not a good basis for science, because you don't just write things off as evolutionary mistakes. Creation is a much better basis for science, because you look at something and say, well, this looks a bit strange, but if it was designed and it works, we need to do some more research and to find out. So the retina is actually an example of really brilliant design when people go and study it properly. Now, another common criticism of the human body is that the spine is badly designed for supporting the body, and down at the very end of it, there's this useless tailbone, which is an evolutionary leftover. Well, in fact, the spine is very well designed for supporting the body because we stand upright. Now, yes, lots of people do have back problems, but like any hard-working machine, the hardest working bits tend to wear out first. That's a reminder that our bodies are going downhill. The whole history of the world is starting from created perfection to degeneration. The history of the world is from good to bad to worse, and so our bodies tend to wear out, particularly if we misuse them and abuse them and don't use them properly. But the human spine with all of these curves in it is actually a piece of brilliant design, because if you were to draw a line down through the center of gravity, the center of gravity for the body is actually down in the pelvis. But if you were to draw a line that sort of goes down vertically through the whole body, you'll see that the spine is very well balanced around the line of the gravity, and those curves actually keep that balance very well. So up the top, you've got the cervical vertebra, the neck vertebra, which curve in front of the line of gravity. Then the thoracic vertebra, the chest ones, the curve goes the other way. So we go from in front of the line to behind it, then back to in front of it with the lumbar curve. That's the small of the back there. And then it curves back out again. So it's a really nice piece of balancing that allows the spine to be flexible, but at the same time gives good support. Now, the other very, very common idea, which has been answered many times by us and by secular scientists alike, is the question of the so-called tailbone. Now, when this bone was discovered, it's just the very end of the spine there. It wasn't called a tailbone. It's supposed to be, it was actually named after a cuckoo's beak. The original anatomists used to describe things in terms of, well, this reminds me of something else that I've already seen out in the world. I don't know why this particular anatomist zeroed in on cuckoos, but anyway, that's how it got the name coccyx. So that has nothing to do with tails. That was an idea that came later on, when the evolutionists decided that we were descended from a creature that had a tail. And we need to remind ourselves that apes, who are supposedly our closest evolutionary ancestors, they don't have tails. So I don't know whether the coccyx in the ape is considered to be a vestigial organ or not. You have to go back to the monkeys. But anyway, the coccyx is there for a purpose, just like the rest of our bones. So if we put the end of the spine there into its context, where it is part of a ring of bones that forms the pelvis, between those bones, you have ligaments and you have muscles, and they need anchor points. They need attachment sites so that the muscles which support all the pelvic organs can actually work, and also the ligaments can then support those muscles. And I don't know if anyone in the audience or anyone in the studio has ever had a damaged coccyx. If you've ever fallen down hard, Just ask anyone who's ever broken their coccyx or even bruised it and damaged it. It's absolute utter misery. You have a really hard time even walking, and certainly with pelvic organ functions, you really notice it when you go to the toilet. So it's an essential part of the skeleton, just like any other part of the skeleton, and it does have a function because bones are very important as muscle attachments and ligament attachments and support, as well as for movement. And finally, the other one that I thought we'd look at is a common question we have had. We have answered this in the Ask site and the fact filers. Why are the mouth, nose, and throat all interconnected so that our airways connect with the path for swallowing food, which makes it easier for us to choke or die of aspiration pneumonia if you absorb any liquids that go down into your lungs where they might ferment and become infected. Well, in fact, that does happen, particularly in people who have compromised nervous system which controls all of this. But in general, this system works very well. In fact, it has some important functions, but it does look odd. Now, if we remove all of those labels and just look at the pathway that the air and the food have to go through, right? We breathe through our noses, the air comes down from the nose, down the back of the throat, and then it has to go to the front of those two passages there through the larynx, that's the voice box, and down into the lungs. Right, when we swallow, food goes from the mouth and it has to go to the back of the throat and then down the esophagus. And so you've got two pathways that seem to be in competition with one another and cross over. And yes, we've all had the experience of trying to breathe and swallow at the same time, and something has gone down the wrong way. Now, fortunately, we have a backup system called the cough reflex, where we can usually cough whatever has gone down the wrong way. We can usually cough that up. But in fact, that connection is actually essential to life. When the having the air path and the food path, and it is essential to life, but there is a built-in system for protecting the airways when you swallow. When you swallow, and you can just feel this in your own throat, or you see it in someone if you're looking at their neck. When you swallow, the larynx, the voice box, gets pulled up by the muscles that are in the base of the mouth there, and which means that that little flap at the top there, which is called the epiglottis, when you pull the larynx up, that gets folded down, and it does actually close off the airway for that brief period when you are swallowing and food or liquid from the mouth has to go past there. So there is a built-in system for a temporary disconnection, if you like, for when we are swallowing, so that we don't randomly have food and drink going down into the airways. Now, sometimes that does fail, but usually because there's some sort of weakness or illness, and the reflexes there just don't work quite as quickly. But again, the human body is going downhill just like everything else is. But for most of our time, these connections are essential. For a start, we need a backup for breathing. We cannot go without air going in and out of the lungs for very long. So it is important that the mouth is open to the airways as well. I remember once reading a science fiction story where someone described, how people like to go to town and make up these weird aliens, and someone had made up a weird alien whose mouth was down sort of somewhere near its stomach, away from its from its nose, so that those two passages were separated. Well, you could kill that alien with a punch in the nose, because that would just block up the airways and you wouldn't have a backup system. So we do need a backup system. When you catch a cold and your airways are all blocked up, when your nose is blocked, it is good provision that you can still breathe through your mouth, even though it's not as efficient and it doesn't humidify and clean the air as effectively as the nose does. So we need that backup system because breathing is just so essential. Now, in order to speak, we need what's called phonation, which is the noise that the larynx or the voice box makes. But we can't speak unless we can articulate. In other words, we use the muscles around our mouth and our throat and the soft palate in order to mold the sound and make words. So it is important that air which is coming back up from the lungs when you speak goes into the mouth. So we need that connection. It's absolutely essential for speech, which is an essential human function. That's one of the things that really sets us off from the animals and enables us to communicate with one another and with God. And another one that you might not have thought about is when you are drinking, particularly drinking through a straw, you need that connection because you form a seal with your lips around your whatever you're drinking from, particularly if you're drinking through a straw. And then you use the respiratory system to just create a partial vacuum to lower the pressure in the back of the throat there in order to drink liquids. So those connections are not bad design. They are actually essential.